Okay, this is lecture number 7 for the course Europe and the United States in the 20th century. And in this lecture, we are going to outline some of the main developments in terms of the origins of the Cold War. And in particular, we're going to consider how this actually influenced events in Europe. And basically, the main question that I want to try and address is why the United States did not retreat back into a policy of isolationism. So what was it about the end of the Second World War and in the immediate years after that that ensured that the United States did not, as it had done immediately after the First World War, again retreat into an isolationist posture and more or less disengage from the political affairs of Europe. As a way of introducing this topic, I think it's important to note the context. And this slide, I'm going to pass over the next couple of slides fairly quickly, but it's mainly outlining. This slide basically gives some basic statistics regarding Western Europe's economic condition. To sum up, unsurprisingly, after 6 years of war, not great. So the war obviously has a very negative impact on various sectors of the European economy. First point notes that agricultural production is half a pre-war level. Industrial production in most countries at very low levels. Point number 2, saying 35% of pre-war level in France. Communications network damaged. 740 out of 948 important bridges destroyed. Obviously, Europe's road network, rail networks badly damaged as a consequence of the war. And above all else, you have around 11 million displaced persons, DPs, as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration described them as being. Obviously, people are homeless, wandering the roads of Europe. They're not going to be economically productive. In fact, they're going to be a drain. So overall, Europe's economic condition in 1945 was pretty dire. As a general rule of thumb, I think it's worth noting that the further east that you went, the worse things got. So Britain, yes, it's badly damaged as a result of German bombing during the Second World War, the Blitz, things like that. But in comparison to Germany itself, which is occupied, experiences the full force of Allied strategic bombing in the closing stages of the Second World War. In comparison to Germany, Britain comes out of the war in not too bad a shape, but at least nothing like as bad a condition as Germany itself. Then if you move further east again, you have countries like Poland, which really kind of experienced the full force of Nazi brutality during its occupation. Further east again, you move on to the Soviet Union, and nobody's entirely sure how many people were killed as a result of the Second World War, but it ran into millions and millions and millions of people. You get estimates 20 million, 30 million, maybe even up to 40 million. So, as I say, overall, Europe's economic condition pretty grim in 1945. In contrast, the United States emerges from the war in a much, much stronger position. And again, a few statistics. So whereas most of the world's other countries, or at least industrialized countries, the war is a sort of economic catastrophe for them, the United States is the one major power in the world that emerges economically in a much stronger position. In real terms, first point there, in real terms, US GNP during the war increases by about 50%. In possession of 50% of the world's wealth, 2/3 of industrial production, had most of the world's gold reserves, virtually all the world's gold reserves by 1945, biggest navy, possessed the atomic bomb, which very much reflected its technological prowess and its industrial and engineering prowess as well. So by, in the space of 3 years, the United States builds an atomic bomb, if not from scratch, because it was actually the bomb project actually begins its life in Britain, but nonetheless, from a very, very low level, the bomb, a usable atomic bomb is produced, which then, of course, is used against Japan. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, bringing the Second World War to a conclusion. The title of the slide here says the United States emergence as a global superpower. I think it's just worth considering briefly what constitutes a superpower, and my own definition is that a superpower is a country which can project its power globally. And by that definition, in 1945, the United States was the world's only superpower. In terms of, again, just staying with this point for one moment longer, in terms of thinking about how the United States could project its power, yes, it was partly because of its military strength, something which the United States didn't really have before the Second World War. Partly it's a product of its naval power, but now the United States has a large army to complement that. But it's also because the United States comes out of the war with a global network of military bases. So, it's occupying Germany and Japan, in Europe and Asia. The Japanese island of Okinawa eventually becomes one big American military base. Has plenty of other bases in Europe, the Mediterranean, Atlantic, Caribbean, Pacific, right the way around the world. There is this kind of network, which obviously gives the United States the capacity to influence and intervene in various regions of the world. Something, as I say, that no other country at that time could really do. The question, though, was whether or not the United States was going to maintain this forward presence, or whether, like after the First World War, it was again going to retreat into isolationism. Now, I think it's fair to say Franklin Roosevelt, and again, I'm not going to go through every single detail on this slide, but just a note from the moment that Franklin Roosevelt, during the war, becomes a committed liberal internationalist. He felt that it was imperative that the United States remained engaged in world affairs. Above all else, he hoped to maintain the wartime partnership with the Soviet Union. So Roosevelt felt that it was vitally important that the United States and the Soviet Union continue to work together once the war had come to an end. His vision of the world post-war was this idea that the world would be that there would be 4 or 5 big powers who would be responsible for maintaining international order. And Roosevelt talks about so-called 4 or 5 policemen, these being the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, China, and sometimes he included France and sometimes not. He also, like Woodrow Wilson during the First World War, wanted to see the establishment of a new international organization. So essentially he wanted a sort of new and improved version of the League of Nations. And of course, it's no accident that the notion of these 5 policemen also become the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So one way of viewing Roosevelt's vision, I think, is to see it as a sort of blend of internationalism and realism. So he had this sort of liberal internationalist vision, but it was tempered by a strong dose of realism. He recognized that it was important that the interests of the big powers needed to be protected. You could not expect the Soviet Union or Britain or even the United States to uphold the international order if they felt that their own particular interests were likely to be threatened in some way. The problem, though, is it becomes clear as the war progresses that it's going to be increasingly difficult to maintain this alliance or partnership with the Soviet Union. Relations between the Western allies, that is Britain and the United States, on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other, were, even at their best, somewhat fraught. And as the war progresses, this relationship begins to deteriorate. And again, there are several reasons for that. I'll list some of them there. The main one, though, I think, is the failure of the Western allies to establish a second front in Western Europe. We mentioned this in the previous class, but almost from the moment that Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union, Stalin is demanding that Britain open up a second front in France. Once the United States comes into the war, Stalin continues with these requests or with these demands. So throughout 1942, 1943, Stalin is desperate to see American British troops arrive in Western Europe. As we noted last week, though, Churchill was never enthusiastic about this idea and persuades Roosevelt instead in 1942-43 to pursue a strategy that focused first on North Africa and then the Mediterranean with the invasion of Italy. So it's not until June 1944 that Allied forces, American, British, other countries' forces, start to arrive in France in significant numbers. So, from Stalin's perspective, this is basically 2 years too late. Should also be noted that, by the summer of 1944, the war in the East has by this point turned decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. So when British and American troops do arrive in significant numbers, the Soviet Union's position is no longer nothing like as desperate as it had once been. To move over the other points very quickly, it's important to note that the lion's share of the fighting during the Second World War was conducted on the Second Front. So, the war is effectively won and lost in the East. The campaigns in the West are something of a sideshow from that perspective. Stalin, not informed of the Manhattan Project, though of course he knew it. His own spies had given him plenty of information about the American bomb project. Ultra secrets, not shared with the Soviets. Ultra being signals intelligence, the fact that the Allies had cracked Nazi codes, but this intelligence was not shared with the Soviet Union. Above all else, though, the future of Eastern Europe becomes a particularly contentious issue, especially at the moment when the Red Army starts to advance out of its own territory and into Eastern Europe itself. So this is the context for the second Big Three meeting, which takes place at Yalta in February 1945. As you can see from this photograph, you've got Churchill, on the far left in a rather grubby-looking raincoat. Roosevelt in the middle, and as I say, this picture indicates Roosevelt's health by this point had deteriorated quite markedly. Nevertheless, it's a reflection of the importance that Roosevelt attaches to this meeting, that he takes this very long and arduous trip to the Crimea so he can speak to Stalin directly. And then Stalin sitting on the right-hand side with, in his military tunic. I think we can see Vyacheslav Molotov in the far left as well, peering at the Soviet Foreign Minister, peering at the camera. Yalta, as I say, February 1945. By this stage, it's clear that it's not so much a question of whether Germany is going to be defeated, but when. So the Allies recognize they are now entering into the closing stages of the war. Yalta has a very grim reputation, especially in this part of Europe. If you talk to any Polish person about the Second World War and the immediate post-war period, Yalta is almost invariably mentioned. From the Polish perspective, this Yalta is when Poland is betrayed by the Allies. This is where Poland is effectively sold out and handed over to Stalin. I'm not entirely convinced by that interpretation. I don't think it's at Yalta that the Poles get screwed, as it were. I think the Poles were screwed well before Yalta. Probably I would date it at least back to Tehran in 1943, the first Big Three meeting, where at Tehran Roosevelt more or less kind of concedes that the Soviets are going to be the biggest, almost influential player in Eastern European affairs. I think Yalta, more or less, is sort of the icing on the cake, as it were. It more or less just kind of recognises what had previously been agreed. At Yalta, though, in terms of what comes out of it, there's a declaration of liberated Europe in which the Allies promise that democracy would be restored to all those countries liberated from Nazi tyranny. The problem, though, is it doesn't specify exactly what constitutes a democracy, and Stalin's version of democracy is rather different to that of Roosevelt and Churchill's. Promised free elections in Eastern Europe, which again, Stalin's version of elections were probably going to be somewhat different from the way Churchill or Roosevelt would have envisaged them. They also agree, more particularly, that Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. So the Soviets, the British, and the Americans would have their own zone. France, mainly at Churchill's insistence, was also to be given a small zone, which was adjacent to the, which was next to the Franco-German border, that part of Germany. And Stalin raises the issue of German reparations and puts out a figure of about $20 billion. I should put dollars there. Okay, but he suggests a figure of something in the region of $20 billion of German reparations. At Yalta, neither Roosevelt nor Churchill demur. Neither of them reject this proposition in its entirety. Roosevelt, though, is very keen to sell Yalta. He sends back a senior administration official, Jimmy Burns, sends him back early to Congress to give a report, and essentially sells Yalta as the beginning of a new era, paints a very, very rosy picture, essentially, says to the American people that they can expect a long peace to ensue, democracy, human rights to be respected, all the things that we now know was a very, very unlikely outcome from the agreements that were made in the Crimea. However, Roosevelt is not around to actually see any of this. Literally a week or two later, slightly more than that actually, but 6 or 7 weeks later, Roosevelt dies, 12th of April, 1945. So literally the closing stages of the war in Europe. Roosevelt passes away, and his vice president, Harry Truman, becomes president of the United States. And I think it's fair to say Truman is almost wholly unprepared for the job. And we'll talk a little bit about Truman, his biography, where he comes from next week. For now, it's worth noting that Truman himself had not been vice president for very long. He'd been sort of plucked from relative obscurity. He'd been a senator before he became the vice presidential candidate. But yeah, he was basically serving his first term as vice president. So he himself had only been in the job for a few weeks before he became president. During his time as vice president, apparently Truman had only had one meeting with Roosevelt, and he had not been in any of the important wartime committees. In fact, he played a very, very marginal role in the administration. He knew little about wartime strategy, hadn't been briefed on any of the important missions. So, as I say, Truman comes in almost wholly unprepared to lead the United States through the closing stages of the war in Europe. And then, obviously, there was the prospect of having to oversee an invasion of the Japanese home islands, which were expected at the beginning of 1946. Truman, of course, at this stage knew nothing about the existence of the atomic bomb project. The war in Europe comes to an end, as I say, within 2-3 weeks after Truman becomes president. And then, as I say, there is the question of what sort of role that the United States would play in Europe once the war had come to an end. And as this slide suggests, there was actually a lot of pressure for the United States to begin to demobilize for various reasons. One, obviously, there's domestic pressure in terms of wanting to bring the boys home. The war in Europe had come to an end. There were lots and lots of American families demanding that their sons and husbands and whoever should come back home. Furthermore, there was obviously the war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific was very much ongoing. So more troops needed to be sort of redeployed out of Europe to the Pacific. Congress, as I say, very wary of long-term commitments to Europe. So isolationist pressures were beginning to reassert themselves in Congress. On the other hand, you have the Europeans, and particularly Churchill, who were becoming increasingly concerned about Stalin's intentions, and who were basically bombarding Truman and saying that it was essential that the United States maintain a sizable military presence in Western Europe. Churchill talks about the armies of democracy, the importance of keeping the armies of democracy in Western Europe. It's also worth noting, again, I'm going to cut a long story short here, but it's also worth noting that American-Soviet relations deteriorated quite markedly in the weeks after that the war in Europe came to an end. Truman believed that the Soviets were reneging on the commitments that they had made to Potsdam. He has a very undiplomatic meeting with the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, who travels to the United States to attend Roosevelt's funeral and to sign the United Nations Charter. During that meeting, this is the 23rd of April, Truman very bluntly tells Molotov that he expects the Soviets to adhere to the agreements that they had made in terms of organizing elections in Eastern Europe. Molotov says he'd never been spoken to in that way in his life. Truman replies, carry out your commitments and you won't be spoken to like that. Lend-Lease is also terminated almost immediately once the war comes to an end. Literally ships which were sailing across the Atlantic are turned around. Stalin interprets this as an effort of trying to influence Soviet behavior. Should also be said that Truman's most senior advisors, the people around him in the State Department, in the White House, were almost universally in favor of taking a much tougher approach to the Soviets. Roosevelt, Truman's predecessor, had sort of resisted this advice. Truman comes in and he is much more susceptible. So there is a marked deterioration to the point at which actually Truman begins to become slightly alarmed by this and actually invites another one of Roosevelt's old advisors, Harry Hopkins, for talks. Hopkins had a much more, amenable view of the Soviet Union. And in fact, Truman dispatches Hopkins to Moscow on his behalf, despite the fact that Hopkins was severely ill with cancer. And he meets with Stalin in an effort to try and repair relations. So this is the context when in July 1945 you see the third and final Big Three meeting. So in this picture we can see Churchill in his sort of military uniform, army uniform on the far left, Truman sitting in the middle, and Stalin on the far right in his sort of military tunic, although I always think Stalin in these photographs looks like he's a waiter or a ship steward or something like that. Just one vaguely interesting thing to note about these pictures is, yes, you've got the three of them here sitting on wicker chairs. Churchill, though, has to leave halfway through the conference. He has to go back to Britain in order to hear the result of the 1945 general election. And just when he's leaving, he says goodbye to Stalin, and Stalin says to him, "Oh, don't worry, of course the British people will re-elect you. You're the man who's won the war." And Churchill says, "Well, I'm not quite so sure, actually." And then Stalin laughs and says, "Ha, well, at least, we in the Soviet Union don't have to worry about elections." Anyway, poor old Churchill, he does go back, finds not only has he lost, but he's lost badly. Labour wins the election with a landslide. And so Churchill is replaced halfway through the conference by Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, who becomes Prime Minister, and he basically represents the UK in the closing stages of Potsdam. So there's another photograph. Again, you've got Truman, Stalin sitting in the wicker chairs, but this time Churchill has been replaced by Attlee, and it almost looks like the picture's been photoshopped. I mean, it's almost absolutely identical. Truman, Stalin sitting more or less the same, but as I say, the rather plump form of Churchill has been replaced by the altogether more sort of diminutive figure of Clement Attlee. The other thing to note, of course, the conference is held at Potsdam, which is, a small, I'm not sure what it is, town or suburb anyway, but just beyond Berlin itself. So, it was a very clear statement, the final major summit meeting between the three big powers taking place right in the heart of the defeated Germany. So as the slide says, third and last Big Three meeting, Truman, Stalin, Churchill, and then, of course, Attlee, who replaced Churchill. When Truman arrives at Potsdam, he sees Stalin very shortly, and almost the first topic that is discussed is the Soviet Union's entry into the war in the Pacific. And Stalin basically confirms that within a few weeks, the Soviets will actually enter the war against Japan. And this was Truman's number one priority. He says in his diary, which he's keeping at Potsdam, this is what I've come for. I've gotten what I came for. I think he says something along these lines. Stalin will be in the war within about 6 weeks or so. Other things that are decided at Potsdam. Well, first thing to note is that not an awful lot is actually decided at Potsdam. They basically decide that there will be regular meetings between their foreign ministers who will try and organise, who will try and come up with the main decisions in relation to the post-war peace. One issue which is touched upon, well, several things worth noting. One is Stalin again raises the possibility of German reparations. This time, the Americans reply, if you want reparations, you take them from your own zone. In other words, there was not going to be some inter-allied agreement on German reparations. Molotov basically says, well, isn't that tantamount to saying that there isn't going to be an agreement? And the Americans say, well, take it or leave it. We are not going to allow you to take reparations from the western parts of Germany. This was significant because Germany's industrial heartlands were in the west, the Ruhr Valley, places like that. So the most economically advantageous parts of Germany had actually fallen into the hands of the Western Allies. Eventually, they do agree to a small amount of trade between East and West, where some industrial products would be shipped from the Western sectors to the eastern part of Germany, and agricultural produce, because East Germany was predominantly agricultural, at least was the biggest sector. Agricultural products would be shipped back to the West, but it was very limited, and even that eventually sort of collapses. It's also worth noting that it's at Potsdam that Truman basically hears about he's informed that the Americans have successfully detonated an atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. So suddenly, I forget exactly when, it's about the 19th of July, so I think about halfway through the conference or so, Truman suddenly realizes that the United States is now in possession of this new weapon, which obviously sort of changes the power political realities. The question then is, does he tell Stalin? Does he tell Stalin that the Americans are now in possession of this kind of weapon? Eventually, Truman decides that, yeah, he will tell Stalin, and at the end of one of the sessions during the Potsdam conference, he sort of walks over to Stalin and says, well, we now have in our possession a weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, with his best poker face on, says, oh, good, well, I hope you use it against the Japanese then. So Truman does not explicitly say, I mean, most accounts agree on this, that Truman does not explicitly say that this is an atomic bomb. But Stalin knows immediately exactly what Truman is referring to. He leaves the meeting and almost immediately turns to his advisor and says, we'd better crack on with our own bomb projects now. After Potsdam, however, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union begin to deteriorate quite markedly. And the main area of dispute is Soviet activities in Eastern Europe. You were beginning to witness the Stalinization of Eastern Europe with communist governments, or at least communist parties coming into government in various parts of Europe. And a general perception in the United States and in Britain that the Soviets were reneging on their commitments that they had made. The Americans protest, put pressure, and to some extent they do win some very minor concessions from Stalin, particularly on the issue of elections. Stalin basically says, you want elections? Fine, I will organize some in Bulgaria and Romania. Unsurprisingly, the Communist Party does very, very well in these elections. They weren't the sort of free and fair elections that the Americans wanted. But Stalin sort of does make one or two kind of cosmetic changes in an effort to try and assuage American pressure, although it has kind of relatively little effect. In general, Americans are appalled at what is taking place at Eastern Europe. There's growing fears about the emergence of a Soviet empire in Eastern Europe, and perceptions mount that the Soviet Union is aggressive, expansionist, and a potential threat to Western interests. This quotation here, which appears in just about every textbook on the origins of the Cold War, this is in a conversation that Stalin has with a Yugoslav communist. I can never remember his name, but he's Tito's right-hand man. Apparently, this guy basically writes up this conversation or refers to this conversation in his memoirs. So not entirely sure how reliable it is, but anyway, it is claimed that Stalin says, this war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own social system, as far as his army can reach, it cannot be otherwise. Essentially, Stalin forecasting the division of Europe, basically saying that those territories liberated by the Americans and the British could expect to see democratic capitalist systems being constructed. In the East, in contrast, you could expect to see communist or even Stalinist systems. And of course, Stalin's premonition or prediction, however you want to call it, comes to pass. So this is the context when we reach the beginning of 1946. And Stalin basically gives a speech to the Supreme Soviet, which in itself was a fairly unusual occurrence. But he gives this speech in which he basically argues that war between capitalist states, so the capitalist West, if you like, and the Soviet Union was inevitable. Now, he doesn't say that he wants war or that he's planning a war, but he basically says, war is inevitable because of the fundamental differences between these two systems. In the United States, though, the reaction is, well, it borders on the hysterical, at least within the State Department. As they see it, this is almost a declaration of war by Stalin. And to some extent, the Americans are scratching their heads. They can't quite understand why Stalin is behaving in this overtly aggressive manner. They are thinking to themselves, well, hang on a minute. We were allies for most of the war. We've given the Soviet Union billions and billions of dollars worth of Lend-Lease aid, all this other things. Why are the Soviets behaving so belligerently? So they send out a request to their man in Moscow, whose is George Kennan, who I think in 1946 he was chargé d'affaires in the Moscow embassy. At that time, the United States did not actually have an ambassador in Moscow, so Kennan was the top man. Kennan, a very interesting character, John Lewis Gaddis, who's one of the most prominent American Cold War historians. He's written Kennan's definitive biography, which was published a few years ago. So Kennan, as I say, is representing the United States. He's a Russian specialist, fluent Russian speaker, knows the Soviet Union about as well as any American. And this request falls on his desk. So, the State Department says, can you, give us an analysis of Soviet behavior? And Kennan responds to this request with alacrity, producing a very, very detailed analysis, which becomes known as the Long Telegram. It's actually 4 or 5 telegrams pieced together. But anyway, it's one of the sort of classic Cold War documents, and I'm sure if you punch Long Telegram into Google, it will kind of come straight up, so you can read it for yourself. But to summarize it, Kennan basically says Soviet hostility is a product of several different factors. He says it's partly a cultural thing. He says that the Russians for centuries have been deeply distrustful of foreigners. So he basically sort of roots, he traces, as I say, Russian hostility back, all the way into kind of Russian culture. But he also says it's a product of the Soviet system, the fact that the Soviet Union is a totalitarian system. And Kennan basically says the Soviet Union needs to have some kind of external enemy. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany fit the bill perfectly. Now that the war was over, though, and now that Nazi Germany was defeated, the Soviets needed another external enemy, and who better than the biggest capitalist power, which was now also a military superpower. So who better than the United States? Kennan basically, I forgot to mention this a moment ago, but Kennan basically says they need to have an external enemy in order to justify the repressive nature of the system. You needed to have something out there in order to say, this is why we need to have this police state. So Kennan says, the Soviet Union is always going to be hostile to us. He also says that, I think he sort of elaborates this argument in an anonymous article that he writes for Foreign Affairs, but in which he starts to consider what America's strategy to this should be. But he also says the Soviet Union is going to be inherently expansionist. He says that Stalin would be testing the West for weaknesses. He would be probing for weaknesses in the West's defenses. In the article he writes, he basically says that I forget exactly what he said. I'm sure you can find a summary of it somewhere, if not the article itself. But he basically says there's 4 or 5 power centers in the world. Power centers meaning parts of the world which are industrialized, fully developed economically. So, United States, Soviet Union, Japan, Western Europe, possibly somewhere else, I can't remember. And he basically argues that it is absolutely vital for American national security that Western Europe remain, did not kind of succumb to Soviet influence. He says this is the tipping point. If the Soviets manage to seize Western Europe, then this could be decisive in terms of threatening American interests. So he basically argues that preserving Western European security, this should be defined very much as a vital national security interest for the United States. And he begins to kind of trace this idea, come up with this idea of containment. Okay, so he basically says America's national security strategy should be to contain the Soviet Union. What does Kennan mean by containment, though? Well, interestingly, Kennan did not think that the Soviet Union was a military threat to Western Europe. Kennan, who'd spent a large part of the war in Moscow, could see very clearly that the Soviet Union was in no condition to launch some kind of military invasion of Western Europe. So Kennan was less concerned about the military threat of the Soviet Union, but he was rather more concerned about the possibility of communist influence expanding because of economic weakness. So Kennan's vision of what a containment strategy should look like was largely rooted in this idea that the United States should be providing economic assistance and to some extent moral support to various countries in Western Europe. He did not consider the military dimension to be particularly important. It's around this time, of course, that plenty of other people are beginning to be worried about the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill especially gives a very famous address in Missouri at the invitation of the American president, Harry Truman, in which for the first time he's not the first actually, but I suppose for the first time Winston Churchill sort of publicizes this term. He describes the idea that an iron curtain had descended across the continent of Europe. So again, it's capturing the popular imagination that Europe is now being divided. All of which, you could argue suggests that the Americans were beginning to take what was happening in Europe seriously, that they were, that there was a growing recognition that the United States had to remain involved in European affairs. However, 1946 congressional elections, the Republicans win sweeping majorities, and the Republicans are still, at this point, the isolationist party. So there are still actually quite strong isolationist pressures in the United States. As yet, there are very, very few politicians in the United States actively considering and certainly not talking about the idea of the United States giving some kind of security commitment to Western Europe. However, events begin to take on their own momentum. 1946, there is a sort of, in some ways, I think it's the first sort of Cold War crisis, but there's a dispute between the United States and the Soviet Union over Turkey. Truman, if I remember correctly, orders Mediterranean fleet to sail into Turkish waters as a gesture or as a display of resolve. Stalin sort of climbs down. There are various other things happening in parts of the world which show that relations between the two powers were deteriorating quite significantly. Then the next key moment comes in 1947, largely as a result of Britain. The British are basically bankrupt by 1947 and are quite keen to reduce their international responsibilities. And they basically send a message to Washington. The British ambassador calls on the State Department and basically tells them that Britain is withdrawing from the Mediterranean, or at least that part of the Mediterranean which encompassed Greece and Turkey, and basically says that the British feel that the United States should take over. The problem for the US government, though, is that they're not entirely sure whether Congress would support that. So Truman convenes a meeting of the congressional leaders. At that meeting are Marshall, his deputy, Dean Acheson, and they brief the congressional leaders about the situation. In the course of the meeting, at least according to Acheson, he gets up and gives this very almost apocalyptic account of what would transpire if the United States did not directly take over. Vandenberg, who is, I think he's the Senate, he's the Republican Senate leader, says that if you tell Congress this, we will support you. And this forms the basis of what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. Truman gives an address to Congress, basically stating that the United States would help any country which is resisting Soviet interference. He does not name the Soviet Union directly by name, but it's quite clear by this stage who he is actually talking about. And in many ways, you can interpret this as the declaration of the Cold War. This is in March 1947. For some reason, I didn't put the date there, but it should be there. A few weeks later, another major American initiative is announced, and this is the Marshall Plan, named after Truman's new Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, who had been the Army Chief of Staff during the Second World War. He gives an address at Harvard University in, I think it's June 1947, announcing that the United States was willing to provide large-scale economic assistance in order to aid Europe's economic recovery from the war. As this quotation here indicates, he couches this plan or this initiative very much in humanitarian terms. It should also be noted that the plan was open to all European countries, so not just Western Europe, but also, it was notionally open to Eastern Europe as well. And in fact, initially, the communist governments in Eastern Europe are interested. A conference is convened in Paris, and communist delegations, including from the Soviet Union, arrive, interested and receptive when it comes to this initiative. Soon becomes clear, though, that there are various conditions going to be attached to this aid, notably the sort of liberalization and opening up of the various economies, which were going to be completely unacceptable to Stalin. So in the event Stalin basically pulls out the Soviet delegation and also other Eastern European delegations, the Czech leader Masaryk says that he goes to the Paris meeting as the foreign minister of a sovereign government, comes back as a Soviet lackey, and a few months later he too would be dead after the Czech coup. The Marshall Plan. Just a couple of things to say before I move on from the Marshall Plan. We'll talk more about the economic aspects of the plan in more detail when we talk a little bit about the post-war European economy and European integration. For now, it's worth noting, though, that the plan may well have been economic in terms of its practicalities, but its underlying motivation was primarily strategic, and it very much reflects Kennan's own particular outlook. As I say, Kennan put the emphasis on Kennan feared Western Europe's economic weakness more than anything else. He said, essentially, he says that European governments, they need to be more concerned about the threat from within as opposed to the threat from without. The threat from within meaning communist parties, fellow travellers, perhaps seizing power or taking control of Western European countries. As I say, Kennan did not think that some kind of military invasion or intervention on the part of the Soviet Union was particularly likely. He felt it was far more likely, as I say, that communist parties would manage to seize power as a result of Western Europe's economic weakness. And this was not an entirely irrational, or it was an entirely irrational belief. There was a very strong communist presence in France and Italy immediately after the Second World War. In fact, communist parties were part of tripartite coalitions in both countries. So it was not, as I say, it was not inconceivable that communists could seize power in at least one or two European countries. Kennan was determined to forestall this, and the Marshall Plan, very much fitted into this developing strategy. What the United States was still not yet willing to do was give a clear military commitment to European security. But yeah, 1947-48, the Cold War continues to intensify. 1948, you have the Berlin blockade, which I would say is the first sort of major European Cold War crisis. I'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we get on to how Germany is dealt with. But as I say, 46-47, as yet the United States unwilling to give a sort of clear military commitment. Kennan in the State Department feels that this is unnecessary. In fact, he comes out in opposition to any kind of military alliance. Kennan feared that this would just simply lead to a sort of militarization of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The problem, though, is that the Europeans themselves feel overly exposed to the Soviet Union. And what you see in the late 1940s is that the Europeans start organizing their own defensive pacts, beginning with the Treaty of Dunkirk between Britain and France, which was basically a reaffirmation of their wartime alliance, or a continuation of the wartime alliance. This is then expanded to become a multilateral alliance in 1948 with the Brussels Pact, when Italy and the Benelux countries join. So a bilateral treaty becomes a multilateral pact in 1948. There's also talk of some kind of Scandinavian alliance or Nordic military alliance. But there's a sort of recognition among the Europeans that these sort of pacts and alliances don't have much in the way of value unless the United States is also involved. The trouble is that the Americans, as I say, if you like, the last vestiges of isolationist pressures are still in evidence in 1947 through into 1948. So the United States is still as yet unwilling to take the final step and commit itself to participating in some kind of multilateral military alliance. This changes in the spring of 1948. There's a couple of events which ultimately serve to persuade the Americans that direct military participation is necessary. Of these, I think probably the most significant is the Czech coup in March 1948. Up until 1948, Czechoslovakia still notionally has a non-communist government, but then the communists seize power. And this sends shockwaves through Washington. Alarm bells start ringing, and it's a very clear evidence of this Stalinization of Eastern Europe. And the Americans simply tell the Europeans, okay, we are now all in. We are now willing to finally give some kind of military commitment. And of course, the following year, April 1949, sees the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty, which has 12 original members, including the United States and Canada, as well as all the countries which have been involved in the Brussels Pact. Several Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, also become members. If you read the North Atlantic Treaty, the one thing that's notable is that the treaty mentions the United Nations Charter a lot, also talks a lot about democracy, although one of its members, Portugal, was not democratic, which is interesting. Portugal included in the alliance because Portugal was deemed to be strategically too important to exclude it. Partly because it was on the sort of western seaboard of Europe, partly because Portugal possessed the Azores Islands in the mid-Atlantic, which the Americans wanted for a military base. So despite its undemocratic credentials, Portugal was invited. Spain, though, deemed to be less strategically important and therefore excluded. So Franco's Spain, because of the undemocratic nature of its government, the fact that Spain had an authoritarian regime, ensured that it would be excluded and doesn't become part of NATO until, I think, the 1980s after Franco's death. The key article in the North Atlantic Treaty is Article 5, which again, the language here is quite interesting. In that, it's the final couple of lines which are important. I'm just finding it here. It says here, will assist party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, this is the important bit, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Yeah, the language here is quite ambiguous. Such action as it deems necessary. And sometimes Article 5 is described as being a semi-automatic commitment to the use of force. The reason for that, the language, as I say, is more ambiguous than had been the language which was contained in the Brussels Pact, which had been, which was signed the previous year. The reason for that is that the United States was still trying to give themselves some wriggle room. There were still concerns that the United States might be drawn into a war just because Belgium had done something stupid or something like that. So there was this sort of theoretical idea that perhaps, if another NATO member was attacked, the United States, or for that matter, any other NATO member, might not necessarily have to resort to military assistance. In practice, though, that was a fairly unlikely scenario. But nonetheless, it still sort of reflects that a degree, I suppose, of ambivalence in 1949 about participating in a multilateral alliance. I've got other things to mention about this. First of all, I think NATO brings isolationism to a pretty decisive end. So effectively, the Truman administration was now contravening Washington in his farewell address, saying that the United States should avoid entangling alliances. America was now involved in one very big multilateral entangling alliance. Also to note, in 1949, the United States is signing a treaty, but the actual institutions, the actual organization, the international organization, follows a little bit later. So like institutions like the Atlantic Council, the Assembly, and things like that. Another thing worth noting, and again, we'll talk about this in rather more detail in the next class, is that the German factor was also quite significant in terms of explaining why NATO comes to fruition. So yes, it's, to a large degree, it's a response to this perceived threat of the Soviet Union. But Germany is also a factor when it comes to Allied decision making. And there's this very famous quote by Lord Ismay, who was NATO's first Secretary General, who quipped, "The purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down." And as I think as a nice little summation of what NATO's role was, it can't really be improved upon. That was exactly what NATO was designed to do: keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and above all, the Germans down. And I will conclude on that point.